the message to Africa has always been the same: challenge the West and die. And history shows they've meant every single word. Every time Africa has tried to break free from the chains of its captors, the response has been hasty and brutal. Patrice Lumumba lasted just 67 days before they silenced him. Thomas Sankara was mercilessly gunned down after 4 short years. And Muammar Gaddafi, the man who dared to dream of a Pan-African currency, met a death so cold-blooded, the world watched in shock. It's a pattern written in blood, a warning carved into African history that the West never lets go. Yet, in spite of this bloody history, there are still those bold enough to climb that same perilous hill. And right now, standing at its very peak is a man the West cannot ignore: Ibrahim Traore. In just 3 years, this man has gone from an unknown officer to a symbol of defiance and freedom, electrifying millions across Africa while making power brokers in Western capitals lose sleep. And just at only 37, some hail him as the continent's liberator. Others say that he's a dangerous radical. And to understand why he inspires such loyalty and such fear, we have to start from the very beginning. As a junior officer stationed in Burkina Faso's troubled northern regions, Ibrahim witnessed French military operations that seemed more focused on protecting mining installations than protecting people. He watched foreign advisors make strategic decisions about Burkina territory. He saw how intelligence was shared selectively, resources allocated based on foreign priorities, and local commanders often sidelined in favor of foreign expertise. Burkina Faso in the 2010s was a nation trapped between its colonial past and an uncertain future. The statistics tell a story of methodic exploitation disguised as development. Despite sitting on some of Africa's richest gold deposits, producing over 60 tons annually by 2020, Burkina Faso remained one of the world's poorest countries. The Human Development Index ranked it 182nd out of 189 countries. Life expectancy was just 61 years, and only 36% of the population had access to clean water. The gold flowed north to European markets through companies like Endeavour Mining and Orezone Gold Corporation, while the communities living above these deposits remained in poverty. Mining revenues accounted for over 10% of government income, yet the proceeds barely trickled down to ordinary Burkinabés. The terrorism crisis that would later define Ibrahim's career began escalating around 2015. Islamic militant groups, many armed with weapons that had flooded the region after NATO destruction of Libya, began targeting the Sahel with increasing frequency and sophistication. In Burkina Faso, the first major attack hit the splendid hotel in Ouagadougou in January 2016, killing 30 people. And from then, more attacks followed. From schools to mosques and markets, nowhere was safe. Entire regions of the country became no-go zones. Teachers fled schools, health workers abandoned clinics, and traditional authorities lost control of communities they had governed for generations. The human cost was staggering. Families were torn apart as young men fled to avoid forced recruitment by militant groups. Women and children crowded into displacement camps where basic services were virtually non-existent. Ibrahim, now a captain, was leading operations in these conflict zones, watching his country bleed, while foreign forces seemed more interested in protecting mining sites than saving lives. President Marc Christian Kabore, elected in 2015, followed the international playbook, accepting aid, implementing reforms demanded by foreign partners, and maintaining cooperation agreements. Yet security kept deteriorating. The economy stagnated, and public frustration grew even more. By 2021, protests erupted across Burkina Faso demanding Kabore's resignation. The military, including Ibrahim's units, watched as their president seemed more responsive to foreign ambassadors than to his own people's cries for help. The breaking point then came in January 2022. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba overthrew Kabore in a coup, promising to restore security and dignity. Ibrahim, like many young officers, initially supported the change. Finally, they thought, a leader who would put Burkina Faso first. But Ibrahim's hopes were crushed as he watched Damiba fall into the exact same patterns. The new government maintained the same foreign relationships, accepted the same aid packages, and consulted the same foreign advisors. 8 months passed. The violence continued, and nothing fundamentally changed. For Ibrahim, watching Damiba's government was like reading a script he'd seen too many times. Another African leader seizing power with promises of change, only to become another puppet in the same system of control. The final moment came during a security briefing in late September 2022. Ibrahim watched as Damiba deferred to French military advisors about strategy in Burkinabe territory. In that instant, he understood that changing faces at the top meant nothing if the same puppet strings remained attached. That night, Ibrahim gathered young officers who shared his frustration. They had all witnessed the same betrayals, the same patterns of foreign interference. They had all lost friends and colleagues in a war that seemed designed more to protect foreign interests than to secure their homeland. It is important to note that the economic exploitation was just one layer of a much deeper system of control. France maintained military bases across its former colonies through what they so-called defense cooperation agreements. Now, these weren't mutual partnerships. They were insurance policies for continued French dominance. In 2011, Ibrahim saw French forces intervene in Côte d'Ivoire to remove President Laurent Gbagbo, who had dared to challenge French economic interests. In 2013, he saw Operation Serval launched in Mali, officially to fight terrorism, but conveniently protecting French uranium interests in neighboring Niger. The pattern was always the same: step out of line, face the consequences. So, on September 30th, 2022, they moved. So swift, direct, and almost quiet. And by dawn, Ibrahim was on national television making an announcement that would reverberate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders.
Well, army officers in Burkina Faso have announced the overthrow of military leader Paul-Henri Damiba. Captain Ibrahim Traore has been declared the new head of the West African country. On Friday, explosions and heavy gunfire were reported near the presidential palace in the capital, Ouagadougou. It's Burkina Faso's second coup in just 9 months.
At 34, Ibrahim Traore had just become the world's youngest head of state. But more than that, he had positioned himself as the leader of what would become the most comprehensive challenge to Western influence in Africa since independence. His first actions as head of state sent immediate signals that this would be different from previous changes in government. Instead of seeking recognition from Western capitals, Ibrahim's first priority was communicating directly with the Burkinabe people. Instead of reassuring foreign investors, he focused on reassuring ordinary citizens that their government would finally put their interests first. Within weeks, his revolutionary agenda began taking shape. In December 2022, Ibrahim formally requested the departure of all French military forces from Burkina Faso. For decades, the presence of French troops had served as both a security guarantee for foreign economic interests and a psychological reminder of Burkina Faso's subordinate status. By expelling them, Ibrahim was declaring that his country would no longer accept the premise that African security required European supervision. But Ibrahim understood that you can't just tear down the old system without building something new to replace it. While Western governments and media focused on his confrontational rhetoric, he was quietly constructing alternative relationships that could provide security and development support without the strings and cane attached to traditional Western partnerships. Russian military advisors began arriving in Ouagadougou to provide training and equipment for Burkinabe forces. Chinese companies were invited to bid on infrastructure projects previously reserved for European firms. Iranian specialists offered expertise in agricultural development and food processing. Ibrahim explained that Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation when questioned about these new partnerships, and that his country will work with any country that respects their sovereignty and contributes to their development. meaning that the era of exclusive relationships based on colonial history was over. From this moment forward, the economic transformation was equally structured. Ibrahim's government began renegotiating mining contracts to ensure that a larger percentage of revenues remained in Burkina Faso. Processing facilities were established to add value to raw materials before export. Agricultural programs were launched to reduce food imports and achieve greater self-sufficiency. Most controversially, Ibrahim announced that the transition back to civilian rule would be extended until 2029. Now, this particular decision drew sharp criticism from Western governments and international organizations. But Ibrahim stood firm, basing his stance on the failures and injustices he had seen up close throughout his military career. The extended timeline was, in fact, a cultural turning point. Ibrahim knew that freeing Burkina Faso from neo-colonial dependence would take far more than rewriting laws or signing new policies. It meant rewiring the national mindset, which involves changing how Burkinabés saw themselves, their future, and their place in the world. His speeches began to pulse with themes of African pride, self-reliance, and a cultural rebirth. He spoke, reaching into villages and neighborhoods where leaders' words had rarely carried weight. By invoking traditional Burkinabé values and honoring historical figures, he wove a story that tied today's fight for sovereignty to the deep-rooted traditions of independence that existed long before colonial borders. He reminded his people that their ancestors had built great kingdoms and empires long before European powers set foot on African soil. Burkina Faso already had the resources and the capability to create prosperity and security. What the nation truly lacked was the confidence to trust in itself, rather than leaning on the guidance of its former masters. Ibrahim's message was resonating powerfully not just in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent, and this was where the West had themselves shaking in their boots. From Senegal to Kenya and countries thousands of kilometers from Ouagadougou, young people were in sync with his vision. The continental awakening Ibrahim was sparking was impossible to ignore. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta is adopting similar rhetoric about sovereignty and resistance to foreign interference. In Niger, General Abdirahmane Chioni is questioning his country's uranium deals with France and the presence of American military bases. It seemed like, for the first time in a long time, Africa had found its voice, and it's speaking without fear. That isolated coup in Burkina Faso has metamorphosed into a regional movement. The three leaders formalized their cooperation through the Alliance of Sahel States. They began sharing intelligence, conducting joint military operations against terrorist groups, and planning economic integration projects that would reduce their collective dependence on former colonial powers. When ECOWAS threatened sanctions against all three countries, they responded by accelerating their plans to leave the organization entirely. For young Africans who grew up watching their leaders compromise and bow to Western demands, this new wave of leadership feels almost intoxicating. Here are leaders who tell former colonial powers no and actually mean it. Leaders who choose dignity over aid money and sovereignty over the kind of so-called stability that keeps resources flowing north while the people stay poor. Ibrahim's influence is everywhere. At Pan-African conferences, he's the main event, the one who gets standing ovations for daring to say, "We will reclaim our continent's destiny." His envoys at international forums refuse to nod along with Western talking points, instead pushing back hard against the way Africa's story is told. This continental awakening was exactly what Western establishments had been working for decades to prevent. European think tanks began publishing alarm reports about the contagion effect of Ibrahim's leadership. American officials spoke privately about the need to contain his influence before it spread to larger, more strategically important countries.
Captain Traoré in Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime.
Diplomatic pressure grew even more, with Western ambassadors across Africa expressing concerns about democratic backsliding and authoritarian tendencies. International organizations published reports questioning press freedom and human rights in countries allied with Ibrahim. Even economic warfare escalated. The European Union imposed targeted sanctions not just on Ibrahim's government, but on officials from Mali and Niger who had aligned with his anti-Western agenda. The media campaign was perhaps most sophisticated. Western outlets began framing Ibrahim not as an anti-colonial revolutionary, but as just another African strongman using populist rhetoric to justify authoritarian rule. Stories focused obsessively on human rights concerns, democratic deficits, and security failures, while ignoring the historical context of exploitation and dependence that had produced these challenges. The headlines all sounded the same. Traoré extends military rule until 2029. They never explained why. They never mentioned that much of the country was still unstable, or that decades of outside interference had left democratic institutions barely functional. Western governments thought this narrative would work in their favor. But it didn't. Every sanction, every public condemnation only seemed to prove Ibrahim's point. To many Africans, the pressure from former colonial powers was confirmation that he was on the right track. He understood this better than anyone. When sanctions came, he called them economic terrorism and turned them into rallying points. When aid was cut, he moved to show that African problems could be solved with African solutions. When the diplomatic pressure increased, he simply deepened ties with non-Western partners willing to work without the lectures. At home, his approval ratings stayed high. Across the continent, they kept rising, even as foreign media painted him as dangerous and authoritarian. But charisma and popularity could only take Ibrahim so far. They didn't stop the bullets, and they definitely didn't rebuild the towns. Despite the promises and new alliances, the security situation was still dire. In fact, it had gotten worse. Militant attacks had risen sharply, the death toll climbing from 621 in 2022 to more than 6,389 just 2 years later. The withdrawal of French forces left holes in the country's defenses, and the new Russian partnership hadn't filled them quickly enough. In the north and east, whole stretches of land were still outside government control. For ordinary people, the cost was astonishing. By 2024, over 2 million Burkinabés, nearly 1 in 10, had been forced from their homes. Schools stayed shut. Clinics went dark. And in many parts of the country, the economy simply stopped. Ibrahim's critics, at home and abroad, seized on these numbers, calling them proof that all his fiery speeches weren't turning into real solutions. They said his confrontational style was backfiring, driving away potential allies and forcing out the very military advisors who could have helped. The economic front was just as tough. Cutting the cords of neo-colonial dependence turned out to be far harder than the rallies and speeches had made it sound. Even with nationalist policies and moves to reclaim control over resources, Burkina Faso's economy was still leaning heavily on gold exports and a handful of agricultural products, the very same raw material model Ibrahim had spent 3 years condemning. Of course, new economic ties with Russia, China, and Iran were taking shape. But they were slow to mature, and each came with its own set of strings. Russian military backing had conditions attached. Chinese infrastructure projects brought in Chinese labor and procurement rules. Iranian agricultural know-how demanded technology transfers that Burkina Faso simply wasn't ready to handle at scale. Meanwhile, the price of isolation was starting to show. Foreign investment had all but dried up. Youth unemployment stayed stubbornly high. Roads, bridges, and other big projects slowed to a crawl as the door to international capital markets slammed shut. But maybe the most worrying sign for the future of Ibrahim's revolution was the brain drain. Skilled, educated Burkinabés were packing up and leaving. They weren't abandoning their pride in the revolution, but pride alone couldn't compete with the better paychecks and safer streets in neighboring countries. These challenges expose some uncomfortable contradictions in Ibrahim's revolution. How could Burkina Faso claim true independence if it still relied on foreign partners, whether Western or not? And how could the government say it was putting the people first when so many were still living with insecurity and economic strain? Ibrahim didn't deny the problems. Instead, he reframed them as the unavoidable cost of breaking free from relationships that had kept Africa in a subordinate position for generations. In speech after speech, he reminded his people that revolution is never neat or painless. It's about breaking chains, and that hurts. Building new institutions takes time. He argued that staying subordinate while calling it cooperation was something no people with dignity could accept. This framing actually resonated with his supporters, who saw short-term difficulties as proof of the revolution's authenticity rather than evidence of its failure. If transformation was easy, previous leaders would have achieved it. If change was easy, others would have done it already. The cost and difficulty meant he was shaking the foundations, not just rearranging the furniture. The decision to extend the transition until 2029 became part of this logic. To his critics, it looked like a power grab, but to his base, it was just common sense. They had seen too many African governments collapse after rushing into elections, only to bring back the same elite that had kept the continent dependent. Ibrahim told his critics that you can't build a house while the foundation is shaking, and that the country would only return to civilian rule when its institutions were strong enough to resist outside pressure and serve the people's interests. And across Africa, history seemed to back him up. Ibrahim's real strength isn't just his policies or his soldiers, it's his voice. He's speaking to something bigger than Burkina Faso. He's saying out loud what millions of Africans whisper: that the continent deserved dignity, control over its resources, and leaders who wouldn't bow to foreign powers. But revolutions create momentum, and momentum can be dangerous. As his influence grows, so does the pressure. Right now, Ibrahim is carrying the hopes of millions who see him as the best shot at true liberation. Failure wouldn't just bring him down. Failure could bury the dream for a generation. The world is watching Burkina Faso, knowing that what happens here will shape far more than one country's future. If Ibrahim delivers security, prosperity, and sovereignty at the same time, he proves that alternatives to Western-dominated development are possible. If he stumbles, he fuels the old narratives about African incapacity that have justified external control for decades. 3 years after that September night when a young captain decided to bet everything on African sovereignty, the verdict is still out. But one thing is clear to everyone, that Ibrahim Traore is already changing the conversation about African leadership in ways that will outlast his time in power. The revolution is unfolding in real time, and the world is finding out whether the message "challenge the West and die" will finally be proven wrong.